Sales conversations where both buyers and sellers win are rare and plagued by the cringe. We've all felt it. It's that sinking feeling that both buyer and seller get when the conversation is going off the rails. My name is Adam Clay. I'm the CEO of Rainmakers. I've spent 25 years building and leading global sales organizations and thinking about the sales conversation. At Thecringe, we put the sales conversation under the microscope and explore pathways to ensuring that sales reps, leaders, and managers conduct great sales conversations. Today, my guest is Monty Ostrander. He leads sales enablement at Netrodyne. Monty, it's so good to have you here. Welcome to Thecringe.
Thanks, Adam.
So start by telling us a little bit about your job and your role at Netrodyne.
Well, I'm in a role called enablement, which really is sales training. And it's interesting because, companies don't hire accountants and then train them how to be accountants, right? So how do we think about training salespeople? It's really more about fine-tuning the process and adding methodologies that, we know work and making it easier for them to take the prospect on the buying journey and making it as seamless as possible.
Now, a big part of the reason why I thought you'd be a wonderful guest on the show and why I was so eager to have you on was because you have something in your background that I think makes your perspective on the sales conversation very, very unique. Tell us about the work that you've done in and around therapy.
Yeah, so I am a trained psychotherapist. I went to USC's Masters in Social Work program back in 2011 and spent 2 years doing a clinical practicum where essentially I performed psychotherapy. What I have noticed is that there are very strong correlations between, what Sandler describes as good discovery and what the kind of top modalities are for therapy. And I've come to the conclusion that sales is really a form of therapy.
And you're not alone. For anybody who's listened to prior episodes of the podcast, you'll hear that metaphor come up. We've had a couple of guests suggest the same thing, that as a salesperson, a metaphor for how you engage a buyer in terms of the question you asked and your disposition and your curiosity and your sincere desire to help, bears striking resemblance to a therapist. We've had others suggest that a good salesperson is like a doctor in terms of their diagnostic skills or a counselor. So when I got to know you and learned more about your background, I thought we could just have a terrific conversation that many who listen to the show are going to enjoy. So now that we've established that, Monty, I have to ask you the first question. It's always the same question here on the show. When you listen to sales conversations or participate in sales conversations, what makes you cringe?
Unexplored pain is what makes me cringe. I think there's a great quote that says, the unexamined life isn't worth living. And the unexamined pain point isn't worth discussing. You're on the phone with a prospect, they state a pain point, and a lot of times we just move right over it because pain's uncomfortable.
So that makes you, given your background, cringe in particular. Somebody states a problem, a need, a pain, or maybe a way to gain an advantage through the use of what the salesperson is selling, and it goes uninspected, it goes unexamined. The seller just moves right past it. Is that what you're talking about?
It's exactly what I'm talking about. We go through all this dance to try to get the prospect to elicit and divulge the pain they're experiencing, and then just drop it sometimes. That makes me cringe.
Why would a salesperson gloss over that? Like, what's going on in the conversation, perhaps in the mind of the salesperson, the dynamics of the meeting, that would have somebody just skip right over something worth exploring?
I think the answer to that is fundamental to the reason we're even talking today, and that's the human response to pain, the human response to discomfort is to get out of it. What therapy does, and what a good sales call does, is it roots the conversation in the pain, and it sits in that discomfort. Are we going to die from this? Are we going to go out of business from this? It's an uncomfortable position to be in as a seller when you've exposed a pain point. And of course, your first reaction is to solve the pain. But what I instruct, my sellers not to do is try to solve. Jumping into a solution or jumping away from the pain is jumping away from the sale, really.
I would have thought the answer would have been, well, maybe they're thinking about what they need to say next. Maybe they're a little too focused on their own agenda and they're just not listening. I hear that a lot from sales people and sales leaders. Like, it's hard to be totally present and very mindful. I thought that's where you were going to go, but you're saying something different, which we haven't heard before.
You've got that right, but I mean, your point is also very salient as well. I mean, we arm our sales force with a tactic, right? They've got a script of here are the 5 questions that you need to ask them, and a lot of times, I think we sort of turn the human switch off, and start just thinking, okay, if I were AI, how would I sell? And I know the next question to ask. And I think that what that does is it sort of prompts AI to take over the sales process. The reminder here is that this is a human-to-human conversation. This is a conversation rooted in authenticity. And that means necessarily listening.
Let's turn the corner and explore this intersection between therapy and a sales conversation. So how do good sales practices correlate with good therapy practices?
There's all these different modalities of therapy, but really what we're talking about is cognitive therapy. There have been 3 waves, let's call them, of therapy, right? In the 19th century, it was Freud and Jung doing very theoretical sort of dream interpretation and archetypes, which really seemed very woo-woo. And then in the mid-20th century, we moved into a cognitive model. Cognitive therapy, at its root, is really just looking at behavior, right? Words and actions, behaviors. What is the cause of those? And what cognitive behavioral therapy teaches is that the reason people act the way they act is because of the feelings they have. And when we start examining those feelings, we can trace a behavior back to a feeling. And when we kind of look at that closer and examine that feeling, we can understand that it was created by a thought. How that relates to sales is you're trying to prompt a behavior. You want a prospect to make a purchase. The father of marketing, of modern PR, Edward Bernays, right? He was the guy who invented this whole brand identity. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew. And he identified that if you can elicit a feeling, you can kind of spark a behavior. The next step of that in terms of therapy really is, what's the thought behind that feeling?
I don't want to go too far here, but is the link that we can now create between what you've just described, the history of therapy and how it's evolved and what some of the goals are, is the link between that and selling at the point of conversation, like the dynamics of a good therapeutic conversation and a good sales conversation sort of bear a resemblance?
That's exactly the point. There are lots of different aspects to a sales journey, a sales motion, right? There's contracts and proposal and all that. What I'm really talking about here is the discovery call. Having this the discovery call necessarily is a parallel to what would be called a therapeutic hour. In that therapeutic hour, you're sitting with a patient, a client, a prospect, and understanding where their head is at in terms of making this purchase. Whether you're trying to solve a behavior problem or whether you're trying to change a behavior, it really depends on the underlying feeling. And that underlying feeling depends on sort of the sponsoring thought. And the sponsoring thought could be, I prefer your competitor, right? So how do we change that? How do we change that thought? And that's really what we do in therapy.
So, Monty, let's talk then about what constitutes high quality therapeutic conversation. Could you just talk at a very high level about what some of the key ingredients are in a conversation that would allow one person to help another person?
It's basically examining pain, plain and simple. It's a client, a patient will come in with a behavior that they want to change. And wanting to change a behavior means we have to sort of map it to what feeling is causing the behavior. And then we look at that feeling and what thoughts are causing that feeling. That's the extent of sort of a high level. How we do that is by bringing the pain into the conversation in a way that is non-judgmental. We talk a lot about safe spaces, right? You've heard this term, safe spaces. What that means is not judging immediately what someone is saying. They teach this, in master's programs in clinical psych, how to not react visually, how to kind of have a poker face, right? When someone says something absolutely horrible, don't pop your eyeballs out of your head. Oh my God, you did what? We talk about holding space, and holding space means not pushing someone or trying to change the way that they're thinking or feeling, allowing them to fully express themselves before we change, the behavior or the thought.
I myself am very tempted right now in this conversation to just leave the holding space and talk immediately about all the parallels with sales, but I don't think that would do the conversation justice. So tell us a little bit more about the concept of the holding space. I think it's something that the salespeople listening to this conversation are going to recognize, but they might not know it by that clinical term.
We don't always acknowledge the fact that humans are highly intuitive. I've seen studies that show 97% of communication is nonverbal. And what that means is that we're always sort of examining micro expressions and very small sort of judgments that someone's making because of our primary drive, social drive, to avoid shame. And so people don't want to feel shame. They don't want to feel that they've done something wrong. And when you give them a space in which whatever they say, you're going to be okay with, at least for this therapeutic hour, that's what holding space is.
I'm genuinely curious about this point. What are some examples of conversational behavior that a therapist might perpetrate that would close down the holding space or shut down the conversation?
It's called countertransference, right? Bringing your own emotions into the room, right? The therapeutic room. And as a clinician, the less you react to what the patient is saying, to what the client is saying, and the more you give them the oxygen to sort of express themselves fully and completely, the more empowered they are. And, empowerment is really what we're going after here. What true therapy is it's not solving a problem, it's empowering someone to solve it for themselves. They've got skin in the game. A lot of times people think, why need to go to therapy? Because I have this problem and I need them to solve it for me. Therapists are not counselors. They don't give advice. They empower you to discover what the best adaptive process you can sort of implement in your own life to make the change that you say you want.
The conversation we're having now relates to the conversation that we had at the top of the show about what causes you to cringe. And to summarize, what causes you to cringe is that when one person in the presence of another person disclosing, their problem or their pain or what they're struggling with, just glosses right over it. How are therapists trained to be fully present in a conversation and to listen with, the sort of acute intensity required to genuinely help somebody resolve whatever their challenge might be?
There's a term for it. We call it attunement. And
attunement.
Attunement. And in some ways, that attunement can seem phenomenological, right? Because it's the woo-woo magic that's happening behind the scenes where we're connecting in a way that we don't always understand or know. But what attunement means is paying attention to very small details. Paying attention, if you think about, psychics, right? A lot of that is mentalism, where someone's really just not reading your mind, but studying your face and studying your reactions and then saying what they think you want to hear. That attunement is based on what we say that 97% of communication is nonverbal. It's about really living in that 97%. What's being said here behind what's being said? What's the sort of the subtextual part of the conversation? What am I missing? And what that really means is meeting them on their level and understanding where the patient is at and then meeting them there.
What do you mean by meeting them there? So that's a phrase I think that a lot of people have heard, and it might carry many different meanings. But in this context, what does meeting that person where they are actually mean?
A way to think about it is politics, right? If someone has a different political outlook as you, how can you bridge that gap to have a meaningful conversation? It's about listening first and sharing second. It's about seeking to understand before seeking to be understood. I mean, if we're talking in terms of sales, it's about learning the pain before sharing your features, not solving the problem.
Yeah, and in a therapeutic conversation, not rushing to judgment or rushing to solutions before it's appropriate. Which actually relates, now that you brought that up, to my next question. So how do good therapists avoid just rushing ahead? Because if somebody's been doing it for a period of time, suffice it to say they've seen many problems and they've helped many patients. And how does one not become impatient with taking somebody they're trying to help through the journey and just stop the conversation short and say, here's what you need? That's got to require pretty intense discipline. And, the corollary, by the way, to selling, which we'll talk about in a few moments, is sort of obvious here. But how are good therapists trained not to pace ahead and rush to solutions?
This is central to both of the topics of sales and therapy. And that's the sea change that we need to make as clinicians and even as sellers. It isn't about our solution. We are not solving the problem. A therapist does not solve any problems. The art and the science of therapy is creating the space in which the client solves the problem themselves. It's, I draw a parallel also to parenting. You don't just tie the shoes because you're impatient. You teach them the tools that they need to tie the shoes themselves. And that's what therapy is you're teaching them psychological interventions. You're teaching them cognitive sort of techniques to reframe their pain into a way that is solvable.
You said that in therapy, there is no answer to jump ahead to. And so, here again, I think the parallel to a sales conversation is here, and we can explore that in a couple of moments. But tell us a little bit more about why that is and what the dangers of jumping ahead might actually be in a conversation.
In the 1980s, we had a new form of psychotherapy that was humanistic. And it's this guy, Rogers. It's called Rogerian therapy. This humanistic approach, really considers each person, as this is where the snowflake term comes from, as an individual snowflake, right? And they all have individual sets of psychological factors that impact their cognitive process. And there isn't a one solution. It's not like, well, this person needs this particular kind of therapy. It's a mix of many, many different modalities. And that's why it really is more of an art form than it is a clinical science. And that art form is really understanding which practical applications would cause the most change based on this individual human. It's customized. And that was sort of the sea change in the 80s. Yeah.
Great salespeople are known to be great pattern matchers, right? They recognize what a good opportunity looks like, what a good prospect looks like, whether, based on my experience, having a conversation with this individual is going to be a good use of my time. That's a fair statement, right? But you just said something that probably has a lot of resonance in and around sales conversations. And I'm going to say at the risk of oversimplifying what you just said, but that is that every individual, regardless of whether they're the same type of buyer in the same type of company, every individual is unique, has a very unique point of view, and is going to bring unique perspective to it. To use your words, everybody is their own, individual snowflake, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of creates a mandate to ask all the questions, to really listen to what that person has to say, because you might find that their situation is in fact different, and there is something new and unique here that you haven't seen before. And if missed, no one is going to be helped. So I don't want to over-rotate on that point, but I'd love to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, therapy isn't a pill. It isn't a script. It isn't a framework where I take step A, they take step B. It's really, modern therapy, sort of what we're calling, one of the major new ones is this dialectical behavior therapy, is based on the Socratic method. It's based on Socrates, and how he would teach was in a very roundabout way, dialectical. And what that means is you're opening the conversation and allowing the journey that the student, that the patient, that the client is going on, and almost prompting them at each turn to start acting in their own best interest. That way, it's an idea that they came to.
Just generally, if you take some of what we just talked about and started to apply it to existing sales methods for having a conversation, or what you think might be missing from good sales conversations that we just need more of, I'd love to hear your general thoughts on that front.
When I first learned, I started my career in sales, right? And I did Sandler. And when I first learned about Rogerian therapy, I just saw the ultimate parallel obvious to Sandler, right? Rogerian therapy is really focusing on the client. It's humanistic, and it's not having a preset script. Yes, in Sandler, there's, for example, the upfront contract is ANOT, right? Appreciate you coming in. Naturally, I have some questions for you. Obviously, you have some for me. Typically, this is how it goes. Yeah, it's a script, but it's really a framework. And that framework is designed to engage in a way that fits within a certain box. I teach my sellers, I shared with them this Gartner study that came out, I think 2 years ago, that said 72% of buyers, especially in the tech space, don't want to deal with a salesperson. They'd prefer to not have a salesperson. Now you got to think why, right? Why do they not want to talk to a salesperson? Are we not adding value? Are we slowing things down? Is discovery annoying? So I think we need to change the way we approach discovery specifically, and make it more focused on the client, obviously. And that client-centered, that Rogerian client-centered approach is based on really listening, showing up authentically, and developing attunement. Those are therapeutic practices.
So many of the modern sales conversation methods that those that would listen to the Cringe would recognize. You mentioned Sandler, for example. They are question-based and, designed to benefit in no small part the buyer. Isn't it sort of already present in the conversation or the intent of these methodologies? Doesn't that deserve some recognition?
Yes, it does. I think, though, and I don't want to use the term lazy, because it's not about being lazy, but I think sometimes when we're armed with a good framework like Sandler or like Spin or something like that, we tend to, this is a normal human response, kind of check out a little bit. Like, I'm going to I know here is the 5 questions. I sort of know this is where we're going. But good therapy and good selling, the parallel here is showing up authentically and being open to receive in a non-judgmental way. There's that safe space where you're empowering the client. You're empowering the prospect to share their true feelings about, the competitor or something like that. And then you can rely on Sandler, you can rely on Challenger, you can rely on all these different methodologies, but those are really icing on a cake, and the cake is the authenticity.
Interesting. And so is it fair to say that many of the selling methods that we're talking about here, you've listed a couple, that they are in their own way designed to create what you referred to earlier in the therapeutic part of our conversation, a holding space, a place for people to open up and talk about what's on their mind, or do I have that wrong?
No, you've got that right. I mean, if we think about sort of the evolution of sales, right? In the 1980s, it was Dale Carnegie, right? How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it's about, kind of the schmoozy, buddy, like building a relationship. And then, I've got the goods. And then it sort of moved in the 90s and, early 2000s to solution oriented. Like, I'm a consultant and I'm here to educate you and maybe even challenge you a little bit. And we're going to solve this problem together. And what I see, and I think the pandemic may be related to this because so much of selling has gone remote. And in remote selling, there's less of that relationship. And it's less about, what I can do for you. I think what this Gartner study shows us, and what I think we all sort of are already intuiting, is that 90% of the selling happens within the prospect before they even come to us. Right. They've done their research. They know what they need, and you're either going to slow them down or screw up the process by getting into, this discovery pattern. But holding that space and allowing a non-judgmental, what have you brought to the table? You're interested in our product. You've already sort of done the pre-work research. Let's just have an authentic conversation where I'm listening to you. And that listening may be, okay, now I know, I can show you this in the demo, for example.
You said something earlier, which I thought was so interesting. You said, in therapy, there is no answer to jump ahead to. But in sales, I would argue that most salespeople, even in the context of a really well-structured conversation, they are most certainly seeking to constantly jump ahead to an answer. And I think what you're suggesting is if you approach a sales conversation in a way that's patently unassuming, with the belief that there may not be an answer, and if there is an answer, it may not be one that you recognize, that's going to drive a level of authenticity in the conversation that's probably otherwise missing. Is that a fair summation of what I've heard?
It is. We talk a lot about mindfulness, right? And mindfulness means sort of just being open and aware and being ready for sort of what's about to happen. And it's about experiencing within the moment a non-judgmental awareness. Now, how do you do that in discovery when you are trying to get the customer to say yes? Yeah. Along the way, there are sort of almost like pauses that you can take that help to build that sense of, I think the reason that this Gartner study shows almost no one wants to talk to a salesperson is because you feel like you're being pushed around. And
yeah, that's right.
In therapy, and probably the same way, like, tell me more about that. Tell me your feelings about that. It can feel robotic. It can feel very impersonal. And what I'm saying here is that a humanistic approach, remembering if we don't want to have sales replaced by AI, to show up as a person and understand that you're a human being, a spirit occupying a body, talking to another spirit occupying a body, and we're connecting on a very authentic, real level. Yes, I want you to buy my product, but more importantly, I want to be of service.
I love your take on that, because that's come up in other conversations we've had here on the cringe. Like, what is the value of a salesperson, in an information age that would suggest that salespeople and even sales conversations are increasingly unnecessary? Anything more to add on that point?
Selling is an art form. It's connecting with someone in a very authentic way and allowing them to share their wants and needs and feelings when they become critical, and then empowering them to solve that problem with your product set. There is a sort of behind the scenes play work that the seller must do to sort of guide the discovery. So it's not just open-ended. Well, tell me about your childhood. That's not what we're into. We're into specifics around the business case. Now, some of the therapeutic practices, can assist with that.
I know from prior conversations we've had that you've got perspective on this, the difference between logical and emotional buying patterns. Can you tell us a little bit?
I think it's related to sort of our cultural sea change, where in the 80s and 90s, it was really selling was about what's the return, right? What am I getting out of this? I think when we look at the adoption of therapy, increasing, doubling in the past 20 years, I do think that we're focusing more as a culture on our emotional well-being. And I think that that's also reflected in our sales processes in terms of looking at logic versus emotional buying. So I do a training for my sellers on how to identify when someone is thinking logically about a purchase, like what's the return, or, what's the accuracy rate of this product, or, which features am I going to get? And I would submit that that's sort of an old way of thinking. And the new way of thinking, especially when we're talking about working with younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, it's really what I hear sometimes on sales calls is they're talking about the user interface. They're talking about the praise that they would get in the organization, the recognition they would get for choosing this solution versus the competitor. And those emotional buying patterns need to be it's a growing trend that people are buying, not just based on logic, but based on emotion.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's an old adage. I don't know where it comes from, but I'm going to say it, and I think it'll be recognized by lots of people listening. It's this notion that people buy things, stuff, anything for emotional reasons, and then they justify with a business logic. I'm guessing many people have sort of heard that in one form or another, but I'm not sure that there's been much done with that on a practical basis. So what's your perspective on how to bring that into a conversation beyond the things that you've mentioned?
Well, I think it's about including the emotions in the conversation, not being afraid. In the same way that we're afraid to dwell on the pain points or, really, really dive deep on the impact or the implication of pain, it's about including the emotion along with the logic and looking at both sides, both hemispheres of the brain, right? And incorporating the emotional aspect makes it for a more compelling pitch eventually when we do pitch.
So what does that sound like, either in the form of questions or in the form of statements? Just some examples to color the idea.
In discovery, it would be something like, here's the solution that, you're describing. If you did have that, what would that feel like for you personally? And that's a therapy question. You can phrase it in a way that would allow for someone to have an emotional expression. A human approach involves not just logic, but also the emotional side of the sales motion.
I'm thinking about, all of the discovery rubrics that I've ever learned, seen, been a part of, and taught. They're all based on logic, right? You're looking for a pain that has business impact and cost implications, and you're seeking to get, a sense of the priority, why it's important to that person. But there's nothing from the emotional sphere, which I believe you're suggesting is the bigger sphere in this day and age. Is that right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the bigger sphere. I'm saying it's an ignored sphere that we just have completely.
Great.
We haven't ever really brought it into the conversation. It's time to start acknowledging that I'm a human being. the prospect is a human being, and we have thoughts as well as feelings, and those feelings are germane to whether or not we're going to buy this product.
Now that we're on this topic, I've worked with different sales trainers and consultants who have introduced emotion into the sales conversation in a way that is designed to spot problems. Let me give you an example just to color it, because I'd love your perspective on that. Like, I think many sellers would be more comfortable saying something like this. Monty, I just shared our pricing with you, and I'm getting the feeling that what I've shared has made you uncomfortable, that it's made you uneasy. And so there's a big difference between what I just said and what you're advocating for, which is probably a more difficult question for people to ask, which is, hey, Monty, like, how are you feeling about all of this at this moment? I've not heard that asked very often in a sales conversation. If we were going to do this, how would that make you feel? That's a harder question to ask.
It's a very hard question to ask. And it's not just that it's hard to ask, it's also hard to say. And when I say hard to say, I mean hard to say in the way that would allow someone to feel free to fully express themselves. Because as sellers, we have an agenda. We want them to say yes. We want them to buy. And how are you feeling if you intonate it in a way that you want them to feel a certain way versus keeping it wide open? Like, I don't know how you feel about this. Can you share with me how you feel? That makes it more open. It's more open versus a directed sense of, tell me, how do you feel about my price? That's directed. And it's subtle, it's nuanced, but I would argue that we should always be leaning towards a more open sort of emotional expression from the prospect, because you're either going to qualify them out or qualify them in with that question.
That's a very powerful insight. And so underpinning the conversation that we just had is this notion of authenticity. And so based on your experience, how does a salesperson show up with authenticity? There's a lot of that being bandied about in sales circles these days. Show up with vulnerability, show up with authenticity. Sure, easier said than done. I think this conversation is revealing. How do you show up into a conversation with genuine authenticity?
I think this is the true work of being a salesperson. I think, if you're in basketball, you practice free throws. If you're an ice skater, you practice your twirls. In sales, you need to practice your authenticity. And what that means is examine yourself when you are being authentic. How does that feel for you? Examine the feeling you have when someone else is being authentic with you. How does that feel? If you can identify that, then you already know what that's like. And then just repeat that. So it's kind of like, you always hear sometimes when people start doing acting in plays, like, I don't know what to do with my hands, because you're suddenly thinking. I would say that taking your thought process and putting it aside for a second and just showing up and being open and ready for whatever they're going to say. And that openness transmits intuitively a nonverbal, okay, look, this guy's open. They're open to what I'm about to say, and they're being authentic and showing up. Being vulnerable, being authentic, all of those things should lead to the implication, the impact. What does the pain mean? And then you can build urgency by critical event, and when does it become critical, and hey, what can I show you in the demo? But really, to distill it all down, it would be impact, impact, impact. And that impact is really authentic expression of, I know that this problem you have is going to impact your HR budget. I know that. Let's talk about it. Tell me your feelings about it. Tell me your thoughts about it. What does it mean to you?
That's very well said. And I just want to kind of reinforce a disclaimer that you just shared. We're not having this conversation so that people walk away with lots of tips and tricks and things just to try out. We're trying to anchor, what makes a great sales conversation in the tradition of other great conversations, and giving the audience a chance to take from that what they will. Because some of the stuff that we're talking about, would require a fair amount of practice and a fair amount of art to convey effectively. Well, Monty, thank you. Thank you for all of that perspective. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. Monty Ostrander, who leads enablement at Netrodyne, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you on Thecringe.
Me too. Thanks, Ad.
If you've enjoyed listening, follow me, Adam Clay, on LinkedIn. I'm regularly sharing insight and tips on the art of sales and the sales conversation. This podcast is produced and presented by Rainmakers, where we believe the sales conversation is everything. Check us out online at rnmkrs.com.